Well, it doesn't appear that many more jumping on right at this hot minute. So I think we can probably get started and then we'll just keep adding people as we continue to go on. But I'll do a quick introduction here. For those of you who know me, my name is Angela Gibson. I'm the Director of Membership and Education for Boise Regional Realtors. I'm also the YPN staff liaison. So thanks for joining us this morning. This is our part two segment of the What Realtors Need to Know About the Historic Homes. Our discussion today will be led by Dan Everhart, an outreach historian at the Idaho State Historic Preservation Office, and Paula Benson, the 2020 president for Preservation Idaho. If you don't know, Preservation Idaho is a nonprofit organization that has worked to protect historic places of significance to Idahoans through collaboration, education, and advocacy for over 40 years. They work with public and private property owners to ensure they understand and appreciate the architectural and historic value of their properties. You can learn more about Preservation Idaho at preservationidaho.org, which I'll add to the chat here. About that chat, before we begin here, we're gonna keep everybody on mute. Put all your questions in chat, and then at the end of the session, we'll do a Q&A and get everybody's questions answered. So type away, please. And I'm gonna turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Angela. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're able to join us this morning. And as Angela noted, this is a part two. We talked about some sort of Preservation 101 topics in a similar event in October. And so I just want to point that out because we're not going to spend too much time going over the really basics. We're gonna sort of delve into some other topics about historic preservation and how these concepts and ideas relate to you as realtors. And we're going to do that sort of in a, I've called it a potpourri because we're going to just talk about a lot of different sort of sub concepts, and we'll try to make it all linear and make sense, but at the same time we'll be jumping around a little bit, and as noted, yeah, questions and answers at the end. We should have plenty of time for that. Before I get started, for those of you who didn't join us in the previous session, I'll just introduce myself as an outreach historian at the Idaho State Historic Preservation Office, which is a department of the State Historical Society. The Idaho State Historical Society is a state agency which works to preserve and protect Idaho's history and culture, and we do that in lots of different ways. The role of our office here, the State Historic Preservation Office, is to collect and manage data on historic and archaeological sites around Idaho, and to use that data to help inform the public and agency partners in their actions about how those sites are impacted or protected. That's the work that we do, and many of the things that we do I would consider educational in nature. This is certainly one of those programs. So let's just jump right in. And we're going to start by talking about a concept called survey. And you know, survey is what survey sounds like. It is the documentation of historic or archaeological resources. It is really taking an accounting of the type and nature of these places and the level of their significance, the nature of their importance. Survey is and should be considered documentation of historic places and archaeological sites. I'm going to concentrate my thoughts on historic buildings because I'm not an archaeologist, but similar concepts apply to archaeology, and that is done in our office as well. The point of survey, the point of documentation, is that this information allows us to differentiate, to decide, and to designate. There are approximately 90,000 historic and archaeological sites which have been documented and are retained in our records here at the State Historic Preservation Office. 90,000 sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but it is just a drop in the bucket to the sites, historic and archaeological, that exist in the state. And in order to know more about those sites that have yet to be documented, we need to do survey. Survey is a deliberate process. It should have questions to be answered. What's in a particular neighborhood, what's on a particular street, what's in a particular part of the state. It is not a random process, but a very deliberate process to answer questions. And so I said that survey allows us to differentiate, decide, and designate. The differentiation is really part of the academic exercise of survey. What makes one city different from the other? What makes one house or one building different than its neighbor? This particular property that you're seeing is rumored to be the oldest house in the city of Emmett, built sometime in the early 1880s, but it's undocumented. It doesn't have any form or information on file in our office, and so that rumor about its history is just that. It's a rumor, and until that site is fully documented, we won't have the information to tell us if this is an important building. Is this the oldest building in Emmett? I don't know. That's the rumor. Documentation allows us to decide. Survey is a planning tool and it facilitates decision making. So what's important on this map, which is a Sanborn fire insurance map, a historic map, you see the footprint of different historic buildings. And maybe these outlined in blue, maybe these are important, maybe these are not. We won't know. We won't know what's important. We won't be able to decide significance until we do a survey exercise. And most importantly, you know, if we know what's important and if we're able to decide and differentiate between these different properties, maybe we know whether this particular example deserves to be demolished, or is it an important, does it have an important story? Is it important architecturally? Is there a reason why it should be protected and preserved? This, by the way, is a photo of downtown Boise in the 1970s, when much of the downtown core was demolished through urban renewal. And then finally, survey allows us to designate. Survey helps us to determine if a site is eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, like this, the historic Mountain Home High School building, which is National Register listed. The National Register, just as a refresher from our last session, the National Register is an honorific designation in partnership with the National Park Service. It acknowledges the value and importance of historic and archaeological sites around the nation. There are approximately 7,000 sites in Idaho listed in the National Register. So out of the 90,000 properties that we have documented, only about 7,000 of those, or about 10%, are actually listed in the National Register. The National Register program, and just as a reminder, is not a tool for control or oversight of historic properties. National Register designation does not mean that our office or the Park Service, for that matter, can tell you or your property owner what they may do with their historic building. That control, if there is that control, it happens through the local city government. And Paula will talk more about the City of Boise and its historic preservation program later on. So we survey to do all of the things, to differentiate, to designate, to decide. What does that mean when it comes right down to sites? I said we have 90,000 sites. documented in the state of Idaho. This map shows you sort of Ada County's side of the Treasure Valley, and those pink dots represent recorded sites. By the way, just because there's a dot doesn't mean that the site is important or significant. It just means that it's been documented. There are a couple thousand, as you can see, in Ada County. Many of those are limited to the downtowns of their various communities, or to close-in neighborhoods in those cities. So Eagle or Meridian, you see a cluster of dots there around the downtown. Boise, of course, you see a much larger cluster of dots. But then where you don't see dots means that no documentation has been completed. So you can see that there are significant gaps in the information that we have about our capital city and about the Treasure Valley as a whole. If you go out to Emmett, you'll see even fewer number of recorded properties. In Emmett, about 125 sites are documented. We could really use some additional survey work in Emmett. And so you see there just a scattering mainly in the downtown core and along one north-south street. That's about 125 sites in Emmett. And if we go over to Mountain Home, even fewer sites. There are only about 40 sites documented in all of Mountain Home. So you see we have gaps, significant gaps in the level of information that our office has on file. So we know that we're missing information. How do we get that information? Well, we physically visit these properties, and that is an explanation in part for why there's so much information missing from our files, because it takes time and effort and money to physically visit these sites. We visit the sites, we photograph the sites, we research the history if possible, we map the sites. All of this takes time and energy. Some of that survey is accomplished by volunteers, but much of it is accomplished by paid professionals. And finding the budget to pay for survey can be difficult for communities, and that's why the State Historic Preservation Office, my office, works to facilitate the acquisition of funds to do that sort of work, but our funds are limited, and so therefore the survey that we can accomplish in any given year is limited as well. What do you see when you finish a survey? Well, you see a series of packets, I'll call them. These are collections of information about individual properties. So this is information about one particular site. You'll see forms, like the one, the cover form to the left. You'll see history and a physical description, that is to say, a written description of the physical characteristics of the building. You'll see maps, you'll see current photos of the building, and if you're lucky, you'll find historic photos that help illustrate the history as well. So again, you can see that some of the collection of information can be pretty time-consuming, labor-intensive, and therefore not cheap if you're doing it thoroughly. You can, of course, have different levels of survey. You can collect more or less information. There's a certain amount of information, a threshold for information that our office expects, and without that at least baseline foundational information, we can't fully concur with the findings of the inventory. So there is at least a minimum threshold of information that our office requires. And so what do we find? And you know, I guess one of the things that I'd like to point out is that looks can be deceiving. Not every site that is important historically is pretty. And so here's the Jim County maintenance shop in Emmett. And you might think, well, that's not much. But it was built by the Works Projects Administration in 1941, part of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And that collection, or that association with a collection of sites across the nation, makes this building important. Maybe it's not important architecturally. Maybe it's not the most beautiful building, although I think it has some nice architectural details. But its association with the New Deal and with the Works Projects Administration makes it important. We wouldn't necessarily know that history or be able to identify that site without survey. Here's a building. It looks like maybe the shell of a building. Maybe part of the building's been demolished. Maybe you wouldn't know that it's important, but if you completed documentation or survey of this site, you would know that this was the Antusticy Polota Court in Mountain Home. It is a Basque racquetball and handball court, one of only a few extant in Idaho, and it's incredibly significant for its association with Basque history and Basque culture in Idaho. So looks can be deceiving. You don't know necessarily what's important by what something looks like. And then you might find a house, something as simple and, relatively unimposing, like this particular property. But again, looks might be deceiving. This particular house, which is on State Street in Boise, was designed by a local man named Cecil Jordan. He wasn't a trained architect, but working with his father, J.O. Jordan, Cecil designed dozens of historic houses in Boise's north and east end, and then he and his father built them together. And this collection of buildings represents an important story in Boise and its architectural history. So while this one house may not alone be significant as part of a larger whole, as part of this collection of Cecil Jordan houses, it might be, or I would say is, significant. And there's some things to remember about survey. One of those things is that survey can quickly become outdated. This is the Errol Little House on Harrison Boulevard in Boise. When Harrison Boulevard was first surveyed, that is to say documented, when it was first documented in the 1980s, this house from the 1950s was not yet old enough to be considered important. And so to this day, because the documentation of Harrison Boulevard has not been revisited, because no one has ever gone back and done it again, even though it's outdated, this particular house is considered unimportant, non-contributing, insignificant to the history and architecture of Harrison Boulevard. Now, I would argue that it's one of the best mid-century houses in the North End. It was designed by a prominent architect in Boise's mid-century, and Jed Jones, and the design is significant. But without going back and redoing the survey, how would you know? The survey's outdated, and we need that new information. So survey can quickly become outdated. It needs to be corrected through updates to survey. Another misconception, altered buildings aren't important. This little house, which was built about 1915 or so, was moved from its original location to its current location in 1937, when it was pretty radically altered. They would have put the stucco siding on at this time and made it into a multi-unit apartment building. But that happened in 1937. well within the historic time period. And so when this house, when this apartment house was documented recently, it was considered contributing or significant to the neighborhood that surrounds it, not necessarily because of its 1915 architectural characteristics, because of the 1937 architectural characteristics. So alterations don't necessarily preclude a property from being considered significant. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. While alterations don't necessarily make a building insignificant, alterations can certainly affect critical character-defining elements of a property. And so this is the Dietrich Larson house. It was built in 1910. It was altered in 2018. And I would ask you to look at this image, and then I'm going to show you another image. Which critical component of this building was replaced in 2018? Just a reminder. If you guessed that the original windows were replaced, you're right. The windows can be a critical component of a building and crucial to its character. They provide so much value about the historic design intent. And so replacing windows with the wrong material, in this case, the original wood windows were replaced with vinyl windows, the wrong operation. These were vertical double hung windows. That is to say, they operated with a sash that opened up and down. You can see in this replacement, one of the windows, the window on the right, doesn't operate at all, while the window on the left slides horizontally. So both of these operations are completely wrong. The material's wrong, and of course the design, the configuration and design of these is wrong. And it makes a difference. It makes a difference to what the historic property looks like. It takes away from the character and quality of the property. Of course, windows aren't the only thing that can affect a house. Exterior siding, wall material, and replacement or addition of new wall material can make a big change as well. Here on the Jones house, you see the asbestos siding that was added after construction. That's on the left. If you look at the photo on the right, you'll see once that siding was peeled off by the current owner, look at all the architectural detail that it revealed. Look at the architectural detail all around the bay on the lower level. Look at the architectural detail in the gable at the top of the house. These elements were obscured by the siding. So whether that siding is asbestos siding like this was, or new vinyl siding or aluminum siding, changing the siding and obscuring those details can be very problematic to a historic property. And I would also point out that not only can it affect and harm the appearance of the building, but it can also potentially disguise problems with the underlying structure. Maybe there was a water leak behind the siding, but you don't know that until you reveal it, or until the problem gets much, much worse than it needed to. And just so everyone's okay, this is what that house looks like once the siding has been removed, or the inappropriate siding removed, the historic siding repaired and repainted. So lest you think that you're safe just with a little paint, because this was a little paint or maybe a lot of paint, paint is not always the answer. In fact, sometimes it too can obscure detail. These are not the same building. Let me be quick to say, these are not the same building. They were built about the same time with about the same architectural design, similar elements, glass block, concrete, and brick, in sort of a modern style. Look at the building unpainted on the left. You'll see lots of architectural detail in the size and placement and configuration of the brick. If you look at the building on the right, almost all of that detail has been obscured and sort of made uniform by the painting of the brick and concrete. And it's not just a matter of affecting the design. Painting masonry, brick and stone and concrete, can actually damage the underlying masonry by trapping moisture behind the paint. You do not want to paint your unpainted masonry. Despite what Chip and Joanna Gaines say on their very famous show, painting houses gray, especially if they're unpainted masonry, is not what you want to do. It takes so much more maintenance to keep up that paint after you've painted it. Just a bad idea all around. Not to limit the, painting to the exterior, of course. For as long as there's been beautiful interior woodwork, there have been people crazy enough to paint that woodwork. And here you see two Boise houses, both built in the same year, 1890. The house on the left, all of that beautiful woodwork on the staircase was painted. The house on the right, that woodwork was never painted. And so you see it in its original color and quality because it was never painted. It never had to be stripped and refinished. This was how it's always been, unpainted. And I hear you, I know what you're saying. Those houses are from 1890. We know better, they're definitely historic. We would never do that to our interiors now because we love Victorian houses. We wouldn't do that. What about this house? What about this great mid-century property in the Highlands? Doesn't it deserve the same consideration? Aren't its interior and exterior finishes just as valuable as the 1890s house? And I would argue that they are. We would consider both of them, 1890s and 1950s, we'd consider both to be historic. And we would encourage you to retain, preserve, and protect the characteristics that make this mid-century house significant, just like we would the Victorian house. And just to press the point a little bit, what about this bathroom? Now, I see a beautiful mid-century bathroom with original mosaic glass tiles and a pink tub. There is a whole social media movement titled Save the Pink Bathrooms. And there's a reason for that. They contribute to the charm and character and quality of a mid-century property. Of course, not all mid-century bathrooms are pink, but those that are have a special place in my heart. And of course, landscaping can make a difference. I don't need to tell you that the addition or removal of trees and bushes can shape how a site is seen and understood. Here at the office where I work, the State Historic Preservation Office, we had these enormous 100-plus-year-old silver maples in front of our building until we didn't. And you see, it's quite a dramatic difference. And maybe those landscaping elements are important to retain and protect. In this case, those trees had reached the end of their lives. They were beginning to, their limbs were beginning to break and fall. They became dangerous, and And so they were removed, but it made a big difference to how the building is perceived from the street. So, of course, this is a National Historic Landmark, the highest designation that any property in the nation can have. And maybe not all properties are National Historic Landmarks. Maybe you don't live in a National Historic Landmark. Maybe your client isn't buying a National Historic Landmark. They probably aren't. So your house doesn't need to be a museum. You don't need to live in something that is uncomfortable. If you and your clients can work together to respect the attributes which make a historic property special, then houses should be, or buildings, historic buildings should be able to be updated and adapted for modern living. Whether you preserve the pink bathtub or not, you should be able to live comfortably. I'd say that you can do both. You can both preserve those attributes that make them special and at the same time make the house or the building comfortable for modern living. Here are some brief rules of thumb. You should always be working to repair historic materials rather than replace materials. If you cannot repair your historic materials, then you should replace in kind. What does that mean? It means the same materials, the same design, the same finish. Think back to those historic windows that were replaced. They could have been replaced with something that was architecturally appropriate in terms of its material and its configuration. And then you always want to prioritize certain elements of your property for preservation. The outside is always more important than the inside. The front is more important than the back. The downstairs is more important than the upstairs. Formal spaces are more important than utilitarian spaces. So these little rules of thumb might help guide you and your clients as you're working towards updating a historic property while preserving the character which makes them significant. Avoid vinyl. Remember, your building is going to look best without the addition of unnecessary alterations and architectural details that you want to add. If it wasn't built with those details, it might not need them. And don't paint your unpainted brick and stone. So that's my little presentation. I'm going to turn this over now to Paula to talk through some other attributes of historic preservation as we continue this preservation potpourri.
Thanks, Dan. Dan covered a lot of information, and it was a little bit of a higher level, which is what we were hoping to give you some background on survey and some of the details about what you look at when you're looking at homes and what's most critical. I've seen some really great questions come through, so I'm going to move through mine. His was about a 10,000 level, mine's about 1,000-foot level high, so I'm going to try to get a little more specific and give you some background that might be hopefully practical, and then we'll get on to questions so that we can get specific to what is important to all of you. Go ahead, Dan. Working on a historic building is different than knowing how to do so. A truly competent architect, designer, and contractor for a project like this will understand building construction and techniques and methodology, from past eras. It takes specific training to know how things were built in the late 1800s or even after the turn of the century. For instance, there were no seismic requirements in past eras, but this can be addressed. Old growth lumber was much denser than lumber used nowadays, so while an attic joist may look like it needs beefing up or replacing, they likely do not. Understanding techniques like sistering onto existing joists and adding insulation without removing the rafters and joists is probably the way to go, and it avoids demolition of the roof. It's the same with the foundation. Foundations can be tied to the walls and the walls to the roof to offer more modern levels of stability. Keep in mind that these homes have withstood for 100 years through snow loads, rain, and wind without falling down. They're sturdier than you might think. We sometimes hear from architects and designers and contractors that the building is deteriorated and unsafe and needs to come down and be replaced. The proper thing to do, as Dan mentioned, per the Secretary of the Interior standards, is to repair where necessary and not replace. And a properly trained project team will know how to do that. If a structural engineer is brought in to review the building, they need to have the same kind of training on historic buildings, and they need to be asked to look at the house not through the 2020 code standards, but through the construction techniques that were in place when the house was built. The question needs to be asked specifically of them: how can this building be saved? Don't just look for a rubber stamp for demolition. That will likely not be acceptable to the city in the future, especially if the Historic Preservation Commission has to review the model plan. And we will talk about the HPC a little bit later. Have your buyer ask the potential vendor how many historic buildings they've rehabilitated, not how many they've demolished and rebuilt to look old. A truly experienced project team will save time and money by reusing existing materials. Owners who want to be green can look at rehabilitation as another way to keep debris out of the landfill. And given the current cost of lumber, that can be especially important now to retain the lumber that's in the house. As always, check references and look at buildings the project team has completed to see if the design and execution really is what they have in mind. Go ahead to the next slide. So I wanted to talk about the Boise Historic Preservation Department. This is the department in the city that is tasked with overseeing the historic districts and a number of other things. The City of Boise Historic Preservation Department should be seen as a friend and an important resource for your buyer or seller. The department is tasked with overseeing the local historic districts. As you likely remember, local historic districts are the only areas with actual legal enforcement that protects the buildings in the districts. National Register listing is an honorarium showing that it's met the criteria for protection, but it doesn't convey protection. Whether the home is considered contributing or not, the Historic Preservation Department can help ensure that your buyer or seller does not violate the law and that their project is in keeping with the historical district residential guidelines that exist. These guidelines mostly impact exterior work on the property. The owner can generally do as they wish inside, although keeping with the basic period-specific style of the home is always a good idea and can easily be done while making a home work for modern families. We understand that things need to sometimes be opened up and updated, but you can do it in a way that's sympathetic with the style of the neighborhood. And I think it helps add to the value of the home as well, where there's not a really stark contrast between the architectural and era style outside and the one inside. This is also where an experienced architect or designer can be key to success. Working with the Historic Preservation Department before a project is planned can help save time and money, and talking with them before exterior construction is done is required. You're required to get a permit and to follow that permit to avoid fines or prosecution. The city's taking the requirements of our local historic district guidelines more seriously than has been done in the past. Following the guidelines helps to ensure the vitality and the viability of our local historic districts. And that protects everybody's investment. That was one of the questions. There are economic premiums that are enjoyed by homeowners in these districts. So it's in everybody's interest to really follow the rules. You can find the department in the Planning and Development section under Planning and Historic Preservation. Ted Venegas is the senior planner and would be the main contact, and he's available to answer questions and give guidance. Next slide. This is just a quick look at the page that you go to if you want to find out more information about historic preservation and the department. And it's a very pretty page on the website. It's got a house and all kinds of stuff. But what I wanted you to see is contact HP staff. Here you can click. The most important part is down at the bottom. You can see that there's information on the Historic Preservation Commission, documents, guidelines, and this residential certificate of appropriateness. This page can be a little bit challenging to find, but I left the link up and hopefully you can get there. If not, contact Ted and he'll get you there. Just a quick look at some of these documents can really be helpful for your buyers and your sellers, and getting this information ahead of time is just going to save a lot of time, money, and aggravation. And it just helps make for better and more cohesive neighborhoods and for better, I think, neighborhood relationships even. Next slide. So I wanted to talk for a few minutes about the role of the Historic Preservation Commission, which is different than the Department of Historic Preservation. The important task of reviewing and overseeing applications within a local historic district is assigned to the HPC, the Historic Preservation Commission. These commissioners are volunteers. They're appointed by the mayor to a 3-year term. They meet once a month to hear applications for exterior remodels, demolitions, and appeals for projects that may have been denied at the staff level. Staff level means that Historic Preservation Department, like TED, has determined that the applicant did not meet the necessary guidelines that are in place, and it was denied without a hearing. If that's done, the applicant can take it to the HPC for a more formal hearing. The commission makes decisions on projects and demolition applications associated with the local historic districts, local landmarks, and buildings with city-owned historic easements that protect the exterior. They're separate from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and they're separate from the Design Review Committee. Any decision of the Historic Preservation Commission can be appealed to the City Council. The city has 2 sets of historic district guidelines. One is residential and one is commercial. They impact the 9 residential districts and the 2 commercial districts. These guidelines can be found at the city's website, and they give important guidelines or important guidance as to what can be done and not be done within the historic districts. There's really quite a bit that can be done in your home. I think people sometimes have a hesitancy because they think that they're going to be restricted. There are restrictions, but there's really more that you can do than that you can't do. The guidelines are really easy to read, and they're going to help your buyers know ahead of time what kinds of projects can be done and how to best approach them. Significant time and resources can be saved by reviewing them and using them as guidance when working on the development of plans for a home. And they can help with questions to ask when you're hiring a contractor or an architect. That was one of the questions that came through. What kind of questions do you ask to get to the important information as to whether this is the right project team for you? If your proposed vendor does not know about the existence of these guidelines or is not familiar with them, it might be a good sign to look elsewhere. Remember that repair rather than replacement is the goal. So a project team that tells your client they can build a new design that looks the same is really working against the intention of the historic district. Repair rather than replace wherever necessary. And if you have to replace, as Dan said, there's really specific guidelines how to do it. These design guidelines include major landscaping elements, as Dan noted. So some of these changes, exterior, if you need to cut down an older tree, they need to be reviewed by an arborist. And again, Ted and his department, Ted Venegas, can help guide you as to when an arborist is needed. Our historic district charm and appeal rely on the exterior of the properties really being appropriately maintained. Go ahead and next slide. Finally, I want to talk just for a minute about why the local historic districts make sense. There was another great question about, is there economic value? Place Economics, a Washington, D.C. based real estate and economic development consulting firm, focuses on historic preservation and economics, where those 2 things collide. They've done studies for both public and private nonprofit sectors of clients in the United States and 49 states. There are multiple studies on the economics of historic preservation, including the impact of economics and sustainability in historic districts. These studies can be found on their business website. If you look up Place Economics, if you have some time, you might be interested in some of the studies that are done. They support the positive impacts of historic preservation at many levels of our society. And these are economic, these are money details. They're not just about history being important internally or from a standpoint of just of an overarching view of how we make our society better. This is dollars and cents that matters, and it matters to people, and it's important, and it's an important reason to keep these local historic districts and unprotected historic buildings. As you could see, there's so many of them that are not in local historic districts, but they're important, and there's economic reasons to keep them standing. This is another reason it's important and appropriate for you to set expectations when working with clients, especially in historic districts. Whether the property is contributing or not, it's possible to restore and rehabilitate even significantly deteriorated properties to functionality. These efforts pay off in personal property appreciation, minimizing impacts on our landfills, and helping to support more affordable housing options in our city, as well as allowing for the continuity of the appeal of our historic districts that promote close community ties. The benefits of mature landscaping and convenient locations that minimize commutes and distance to schools and outside venues like parks, greenbelts, and foothills are part of the amenities you enjoy in a historic district. Our hope is that your clients will understand and acknowledge that they're entering an agreement to support these historic values when they purchased a historic property. Not everyone loves a historic floor plan and the smaller rooms that often go with them, but they can be made more functional for modern families without losing the important architectural elements that make the property unique and irreplaceable. The East End Neighborhood Association, the North End Neighborhood Association, along with many other smaller neighborhood associations, work hard amongst themselves and with Preservation Idaho, SHPO, and the city to help craft and enforce laws that will protect their appeal and their viability into the future. As I mentioned, the Boise City government is taking a much harder look at work that is done within the historic districts, and they're working with unprotected neighborhoods to support survey and the creation of protections where property owners want them. The State Historic Preservation Office and Preservation Idaho work at no cost to communities and property owners to help support and assist with information, resources, and guidance. We appreciate your taking time to participate today, and we stand ready to help. As I mentioned to Angela earlier, our help is provided at no cost and it's not binding. So it's very easy to take advantage of what we can offer. And we hope that you'll take advantage of that in advance of any work done by buyers or sellers. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm hoping that we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes here. Some of the questions I think you answered, so I don't know if you guys want to scroll through or you want me to read them. What works better for you? Stephanie wants to know what kind of documentation is needed to show the history of a home.
That's a great question. Generally speaking, the history of the home is tied to its original builder. Not so much the person who physically built the building, the person who paid for the construction of the building. And so the story of a site is generally tied to that earliest owner. And that's often reflected in the way we name historic buildings. We name them usually after their first owner or their first use. So getting back to that information can be really important. It can help you identify the architect. It can help you identify the profession of the person who lived at the house, etc. That information is not always terribly easy to find, but that is usually the first step. So finding the original builder, that is to say the original owner of the property who had the building constructed, that's your first step. That might lead you then to finding who the architect was, what the person did, and finding stories of later owners can be important too. So that's really probably the most important element of documentation that you want.
And I think it's important to address the question of who pays for a survey. It's not something Preservation Idaho pays for. I think surveys are often done, they're paid for, the city does a fair amount of them. SHPO has some funds it can provide to certified local governments. Dan, I don't know the answer to this question. Can an individual owner ask to have a survey done on their house to see if they can justify making it a contributing structure?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I just don't want to confuse contributing and non-contributing. Those are concepts for historic districts, but you don't have to be in a historic district to have your building documented or surveyed. So you can complete that work. In fact, we get inquiries about this all the time. Usually our office will provide a template and ask you to fill in the blanks if you can. Using that information, we work with you to help establish some of the answers to the questions that we just mentioned. Sometimes a private property owner will pay for this process to be completed. There are a handful of local firms who will do that work for a fee, and we'll do that work for you. Somebody else asked, how long does that process take, the survey process? You know, doing the research and writing probably is the lengthiest element of survey, and that might take a couple days or more. Documenting a building with photographs and maps might take all of 15 minutes in the field. So if someone were to, have their house documented, you might see somebody in front of your house for, all of 5 minutes or maybe a few more. So that's how long that takes. But altogether with the research and writing, you might think about an average building, taking a professional a couple, 3 days, maybe a week to do all the documentation for.
And one thing before we go, I'd like to address, there was a good question about finding information on your property, trying to find the original owner. One of the best resources and places to start is the Idaho Statesman archives that are digitized. You can get onto that through the Boise Public Library. And in addition, so through that, if you start with the address and you're looking for names, that can really help lead you to other things to research, reference to a name, and then you research that name, and it's kind of like following a thread. But sometimes you can get to the original owner, or you can find really interesting stories about things that happened. It was a simpler time, and things were reported that you wouldn't bother reporting now. So going back, you can really find some clues that can lead you to information, not only about the original owner, but really about the neighborhood and about things that happened in that house or in that neighborhood. One resource you might look at is recently the North End Neighborhood Association newsletter. They worked with Dan and I and with another architectural historian, Carrie Davis, to put together some resources if you want to research your house. So see if you can get that information on the North End Neighborhood Association website. It was just out a couple weeks ago. We posted it on our Facebook page. If you can't find it, you can email info@Preservation Idaho or paula@preservationidaho.org, and I'd be happy to get you that document. A lot of people do enjoy, especially before they're planning any kind of a remodel or rehab, they like to get the history of the home, and sometimes it can help guide them to the choices that they'll be making.
There are a couple questions here about the cost of survey. The survey costs, if you're not going to do it yourself, that is not, you're not going to do the research yourself, then the cost of survey could be borne in a couple different ways. You, the private property owner, could hire one of these consultants to do the work for you, and then it would be your responsibility. It's also possible that the city of Boise or one of your other local communities like Emmett or Mountain Home might help cover the costs of the survey work. Those costs could be underwritten in part by grants from our office, but our office will not administer grants to private property owners to do survey of their own properties. So if you're not going to pay for it yourself as a private property owner, it's possible that your local community might pay for the survey of, say, a neighborhood. But again, that could be done with some help from our office. There are a couple other questions here. Barbara asks, when were the city directories first published? City directories think of them as early phone books. They're directories to the people who lived in the businesses that operated in a city. And so they provide some of that early information, maybe about the person who lived at your address. The first city directories in Boise were published, I believe, in about 1890, but they became pretty consistent beginning about 1900, published every year after 1900. And then after 1927, there was a reverse directory, so you could look up the address and see who lived there, as opposed to just having to know the name of the person to see who lived at your property. So about 1900 is when they started in earnest. And then there's another question, besides the title research, what other resources can be used to find original owner and builder? Again, the title deed research is actually a really important tool, and so I would use that. It might be easier to first consider using the historic newspapers available digitized and through the Boise Public Library. You can search using your address, or the address of the property, I should say, and that might get you to an original owner first and more quickly, but deed research is certainly sort of the gold standard on who owned a parcel over the years. I The only other questions I see is about finding contractors. Paula, do you want to talk about that briefly as we wrap up?
Sure. I mean, I wish I had a list. I have some people in my head, but I'm not sure it's appropriate to give out specific names. But what I tried to do was give you the questions to ask. And I think the major one is, how many historic homes have you rehabilitated, not demolished and rebuilt? It is easier to demolish and rebuild. I mean, that anybody who's done a remodel, even on a modern home, you just find things that become complicated. So it's important to ask them how many things they have done, and then to go by and look at those projects and see if that end result is the look that your clients are looking for. As Dan noted, you can really tell in neighborhoods when a property fits and when it doesn't. And you can create a rehabilitated home. You could even create a new home. I mean, if something burned down or had to be demolished, you can create a home that is sympathetic to the area, both in style and in size. So ask those questions about how many things have you done, and get references. Talk to Ted Venegas in the city, because it's important to get a feel for whether those folks have been compliant with their permits, have had complaints from neighbors during the process, that sort of thing. That's, I guess, the best guidance I can give for starters. If there's specific questions about the house before they do rehabilitation, besides Ted, I'm going to offer up Dan. You can tell he's an encyclopedia, and sometimes he is able to come out to a house and walk it with your client and just say, here's the significant architectural features that we think you should try to preserve when you do your rehabilitation or remodel. And that can really help clients simplify the process by saying, these are the 4 things we absolutely want to retain, so we need to repair them, not replace them. Or they can get a feel for a style, some things that have been done on the building over time that might not need to be kept. It can just make the process more clear, and the end result, I think, a positive not only for your client, but for the neighborhood as well.
Angela, that's all the questions I see.
Yeah, me too. I don't see anything else. Thank you so much. You know, I did try to put your guys' email addresses in there, and the links that you had, Paula. I put in 2 links, one to that page you had, and then one to the general page. So maybe you guys can copy those and just do some research on your own. If there's no other questions, thank you so much, Paula and Dan, for your time today. We really appreciate you guys helping us out. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It was terrific. I hope it was helpful.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays.